I never should have bought that doll. If I had known what it would bring into our home, I would have left it to rot in that cursed market stall. It was an autumn evening in Mexico City, the air thick with the scent of roasted corn and damp stone. Street vendors lined the narrow alleyways, their tables cluttered with trinkets, masks, and relics from forgotten times. The old woman who sold me the doll had deep-set eyes, as if they had seen centuries pass. She never spoke, just watched as I picked it up. The doll was porcelain, its face painted with delicate, rosy cheeks and lips curved into the faintest smile. Its dress was lace, yellowed with age, and it had long, black strands of hair, too real, too human-like. But what caught me the most were its eyes. Wide, glassy, and eerie blue set too deep into its face. They seemed aware. My wife didn't like it. "It gives me a bad feeling," she said when I brought it home. But our daughter loved it. She named it Lucía, and from that moment it became her shadow. Wherever she went, the doll followed. The first few days, I dismissed the oddities. The way I'd find it sitting in different places, its tiny hands positioned in ways I didn't remember. My wife accused our daughter of playing tricks. She swore she hadn't moved it. Then came the whispering. At night, when the house was silent, I heard it, a faint rustling sound like fabric shifting, tiny feet scuffing across the wooden floors. It was always near our daughter's room. One night, I stood outside her door, my heart hammering, convinced I'd hear nothing. But then, a soft giggle. Not my daughter's. Something else. Something high-pitched, raspy, and much too close to the floor. I pushed the door open. She was asleep, curled beneath her blankets. The doll sat on the chair beside her bed, its head slightly tilted, its cold blue eyes reflecting the dim moonlight. My skin crawled. I crossed the room, picked up the doll, and shoved it into the toy chest. That night, I barely slept. The next morning, I found Lucía sitting on the kitchen counter, her head turned toward me. The toy chest was still closed. I grabbed the doll and threw it in the attic. That night, the whispering returned, closer this time, outside our bedroom door. I gripped the blankets, my breath shallow, my ears straining. Then, a tiny knock. 3 slow taps against the wood. My wife gasped. I reached for the lamp, flipped it on, and nothing. The hallway was empty. But when I stepped out to check, the attic door was open, and Lucía was sitting at the top of the stairs. Her eyes were no longer glass. They were real, and they were blinking. I slammed the attic door shut and locked it. My hands were shaking, my breath ragged. My wife stood behind me, gripping my arm. Neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. We both saw it. The doll had blinked. I barely slept that night, jolting awake at the smallest sound. The house felt different, as if something unseen was shifting within its walls. I told myself it was my imagination. Stress. Exhaustion. The next morning, our daughter was unusually quiet at breakfast. She picked at her food, staring at the table. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" my wife asked. She hesitated. "Lucía doesn't like being locked away." I nearly dropped my coffee. My wife's knuckles went white around her fork. She told you that?" I asked, my voice hoarse. My daughter nodded, her dark curls bobbing. "She's mad at you, Daddy." My stomach twisted. "Sweetie, Lucía's just a doll." She looked up then, her small face solemn. "No, she's not." That was the moment I knew we were in danger. By noon, my nerves were unraveling. I needed to prove to myself that nothing was happening, that my mind was playing tricks. So I went up to the attic, dragging a chair beneath the hatch. My wife begged me not to, but I had to see. The attic smelled of dust and old wood. Sunlight slanted through a small window, illuminating boxes, forgotten furniture, and the toy chest was open. I stepped closer, my heartbeat thundering. I had locked it. I was sure of it. But now the lid stood wide open, revealing only emptiness inside. Lucía was gone. A crash echoed from downstairs. I nearly fell off the ladder. My wife screamed. I bolted down, nearly slipping as I reached the kitchen. The chairs were overturned. The cabinets were flung open. Plates were shattered on the floor. And there, standing in the center of it all, was the doll. Lucía sat upright on the counter, her hands positioned as if she had just placed them there herself. Her glassy blue eyes locked onto mine. Then her lips moved. The words were garbled, an inhuman whisper, dry and crackling like leaves in the wind. I lunged forward, grabbing the doll and hurling it into the sink. My hands moved on instinct. I turned the faucet on full blast, drenching its porcelain face. It screamed. A high-pitched, unholy wail filled the room. My wife clapped her hands over her ears, our daughter crying out in terror. And then, just as suddenly as it began, silence. Lucía slumped motionless. The air was thick, oppressive. The only sound was the steady drip of water from the sink. I grabbed a trash bag and shoved the doll inside. I was done playing games. "We're getting rid of it," I told my wife. "Tonight." But deep down, something told me it wouldn't be that easy. And I was right. Because later that night, as we lay in bed, a soft, wet footstep echoed in the hallway, followed by another, and another, until they stopped right outside our door. The footsteps stopped. The air in our bedroom thickened, pressing against my chest like unseen hands. My wife clung to me, her fingers digging into my arm. Neither of us breathed. Then, a slow, deliberate knock on the door. Once. Twice. 3 times. I swallowed hard, every nerve in my body screaming, "Don't open it." But I had to. My daughter was asleep down the hall. If she was out there, I needed to see. I reached for the bedside lamp and flicked it on. The warm glow pushed back the shadows, but it did nothing to ease the sick feeling twisting in my stomach. With shaking hands, I stood and approached the door. My fingers hovered over the handle. My wife whispered, "Don't." I turned the knob. The hallway stretched before me, dim and empty. My daughter's door was shut. The air was still. Too still. Then I looked down. Wet footprints. Small, childlike. Starting from our door and trailing back toward the stairs. And at the very end of the hallway, right at the top of the steps, Lucía sat waiting. She wasn't in the trash bag. She wasn't drenched from the sink. She was pristine, her lace dress untouched, her black hair smooth, her blue eyes. Looking straight at me, my stomach turned to ice. I took a step forward and the temperature in the house dropped. I could see my breath cloud in the dim light. My skin prickled. Then Lucía moved. Not much. Just a twitch of her head, a slight tilt, like she was acknowledging me. Then she stood. I didn't move. I couldn't. Her tiny porcelain hands flexed. A soft, crackling whisper slithered through the air, dry and sharp, like old paper crumbling. She took a step forward. I slammed the bedroom door shut and locked it. My wife sobbed behind me. "What is happening?" I couldn't answer. My mind was racing. This wasn't possible. None of this was possible. Then something scraped against the door. I backed away. My wife pressed herself against the headboard, shaking. The sound came again, slow, deliberate scratching. Then a voice. A child's voice, but wrong. Too distorted. Too old. "You shouldn't have locked me away." I grabbed the bedside lamp and ripped the cord from the socket, brandishing it like a weapon. My wife stared at me like I'd lost my mind. The scratching stopped. Silence. Seconds stretched into eternity. Then from the hallway, soft, wet footsteps. Moving away. I didn't sleep. Neither did my wife. We sat awake until the first rays of dawn bled through the curtains. When I finally mustered the courage to open the door, the hallway was empty. The footprints were gone. But Lucía? She was back in my daughter's bed, and this time she was smiling wider. I yanked Lucía from my daughter's arms. My wife gasped as I gripped the doll by its lace dress and stormed out of the room. My daughter's sleepy eyes fluttered open. "Daddy," she murmured. I ignored her. I couldn't stop. I couldn't let my hands loosen. If I did, I had the gut-wrenching feeling she would take control. I took the stairs 2 at a time, nearly tripping as I reached the front door. My wife was behind me, pleading for me to stop, but I wouldn't. I threw the door open and sprinted into the early morning fog. The sky was gray, the air cold. I ran straight to the garbage bin at the edge of the street and shoved Lucía inside, slamming the lid shut. I braced my hands against the bin, panting. My breath swirled in the frigid air. It was over. I told myself it was over. That night, I slept harder than I had in days. Then at exactly 3:33 a.m., a blood-curdling scream tore through the house. I shot up, my chest pounding. My wife gasped awake beside me. It was our daughter. I scrambled out of bed, racing toward her room, my pulse drumming in my ears. I threw open the door. She was standing in the middle of the room, sobbing, her small body trembling violently. Her wide, terrified eyes locked onto me. I followed her gaze. The bed was empty. The blankets were undisturbed. But there, on her pillow, Lucía sat, her porcelain hands delicately folded in her lap. She was soaking wet. My mouth went dry. My stomach dropped into a bottomless void. I knew what I had done. I had thrown her away. I had left her outside. Yet she was here, dripping, leaving dark stains on the sheets. I took a slow, unsteady step forward. Lucía's head snapped toward me. I stopped breathing. Her lips parted, and she whispered something in a language I didn't understand. My body reacted before my mind could catch up. I grabbed my daughter, pulling her into my arms. My wife screamed for me to get out. I didn't need to be told twice. I bolted down the stairs, my daughter clinging to my neck, my wife right behind me. We needed to get out. Now, the front door loomed ahead. I reached for the knob. It slammed shut. The lights flickered. The air turned frigid. The walls trembled. A low, guttural growl rumbled from somewhere unseen. And then the laughter, high-pitched, distorted, coming from every direction. I turned, my heart hammering. Lucía was sitting on the bottom step. We hadn't brought her down. She had moved on her own. Her smile was too wide now, too unnatural. Her once delicate fingers stretched and cracked, twitching as if preparing to grab. I didn't think. I grabbed the closest thing, a fireplace poker, and swung. The metal collided with her porcelain face. A deafening shriek erupted as cracks split across her skin. A deep, inhuman wail filled the room, shaking the walls. But it didn't stop her. Through the cracks, something moved. Something dark. Something alive. And before I could react, her shattered lips curled. And she spoke my name. I didn't stop to think. The second Lucía spoke my name, something inside me snapped. My grip tightened on the fireplace poker, and I swung again, harder. The blow sent the doll crashing against the wall, her porcelain face shattering into jagged pieces. For a split second, everything went silent. Then the house shook. A piercing, unearthly wail erupted from the broken shards on the floor. The air thickened, pressing down on my chest. My daughter screamed, my wife clinging to her. The darkness inside the doll, the thing that had been watching us, whispering to my daughter, lurking behind that painted smile, began to pour out. A shadowy mass, writhing and seething like living smoke, rose from the broken pieces. And then it looked at me. I felt it. Its hatred. Its hunger? It had been hiding, waiting, and now I had freed it. But I wasn't going to let it win. "Get the salt," I shouted. My wife understood instantly. She bolted toward the kitchen while I grabbed my daughter and backed away. The shadowy form lunged, but I swung the poker again, this time straight through the misty darkness. It recoiled, screeching. My wife came sprinting back with the entire container of salt. Without hesitation, she threw it at the entity. The effect was immediate. The dark form shrieked, its shape twisting violently as the salt hit it. It thrashed, its form flickering, breaking apart. The walls trembled, the lights flickering wildly. I grabbed the rest of the salt and poured it over the shattered remains of Lucía's porcelain face. The moment the last grain of salt touched the doll, the screaming stopped. The darkness collapsed inward, twisting, writhing, until it was gone. The house stilled. The air lifted. The weight, the dread, the evil, all of it was gone. For the first time in weeks, the silence was just silence. My wife collapsed onto the floor, shaking. I pulled my daughter close, my heart pounding. The only thing left of Lucía was a pile of ashes. It was over. 1 year later, we left Mexico the next day. We didn't take a single thing with us. We burned everything that had been in that house. My daughter never spoke of Lucía again. We moved to a quiet town, started over. And for a while, things were normal. Until last week. A package arrived at our doorstep with no return address. A small wooden box. Inside was a single porcelain eye. And I swear it blinked.